Great. It's great to see you all tonight. First, I want to thank Peter for doing this and giving us the opportunity. Going to have the panelists introduce themselves in a few moments, but just want to say a little bit first. I want to introduce myself, but also say just a little bit about the panel in general. I'm hoping one of our goals tonight is to give you, I think, a diverse perspective on education technology. So we have folks here that have an early childhood focus, K-12, higher education. We have entrepreneurs, we have investors, we have a business exec in the industry. It's a very diverse group, I think. So hopefully we'll have a robust conversation. Hopefully we won't agree on everything we talk about. At least Charlie, I'm counting on you to disagree on one or two things with me here. But share some information with you. So first, just quickly about my background. I'm an entrepreneur by training. I was an entrepreneur in education for 15 years. I had 3 SaaS startups, all in education technology. And I had, like most entrepreneurs, I had my successes and my failures along the way. But enough success to begin angel investing about 10 years ago. And toward the end of the third one, while I was still operating, I got more serious about it, thinking about how to scale my impact. And the idea occurred to me, why not invest in and advise lots of education technology entrepreneurs who are solving problems in education. So I started Edivate coming up on 4 years ago now to invest and advise. We sold the third company to private equity, 2.5 years ago now. And so I've been focused full-time since then on investing and advising education technology entrepreneurs. So I've done 13 EdTech investments to date. I do about 3 or 4 a year, and they're K-12, mostly K-12, but I have some higher education investments in that group as well. So certainly happy to talk to any of you about that experience, wholeheartedly endorse it. And with that, let me introduce this. Let me have the great panel introduce themselves. So I'm just going to go down the line here with Charlie.
I've got a fancy built-in mic here. You guys can hear me okay? So I'm Charlie Coglianese. I'm the founder, CEO, and chief data wizard at SchoolRunner. We do data analytics for K-12 schools. I am an engineer by training. I spent about a decade building data systems for hedge funds and other financial institutions in New York before starting SchoolRunner for a friend who was the founder of a high school that was getting 100% of their low-income minority kids into college. And I said, how can I help? And one thing led to another, and here I am. So now we work like 40,000 students all across the country, helping those schools, helping the teachers use data to figure out how can I best help these kids. Do it.
Diverse set of microphones also. My name is Luis Duarte. I'm originally from Mexico, so that's also part of the diversity of this panel. My background is a little bit random. I had the opportunity to build a couple of companies before joining Gary Community Investments, but I have also worked for the government in the health side, and then I have also worked in the nonprofit sector and in the corporate sector. So as I joined Gary Community Investments 5 years ago, it was very interesting to me to see how many connections we need all to learn from different sectors and different industries, and how can you apply best practices from an innovative kind of entrepreneurial mindset into whatever sector you're working on. At Gary Community Investments, which includes the Piton Foundation, we do philanthropic and for-profit investments to support low-income children and their families in the state of Colorado. And we have become very actively, I think, investors in the early childhood sector. So I'm happy to share some of the experiences that we have had with that.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Shannon Moore-Zuffoletto, and I'm currently employed by Cengage, which is a really large education technology company. I've been in education, mostly higher education, for the last 23 years, working both domestically and internationally in creating transnational models where students can learn from all over the world from the American education system, and particularly around technology and rolling out technologies into those developing countries, and again, trying to serve more underserved communities. My current role, though, is mostly based in the United States, and we're working on rolling out large enterprise technologies for institutions and trying to help improve their efficiency and improve students' learning.
And I'm Kyle Klopcic. I work at the Colorado Impact Fund, which is a $65 million venture capital fund just a few blocks down the 16th Street Mall on 16th and Blake. We invest in Colorado-based companies that are doing things that contribute to positive community outcomes. So we invest in everything from healthcare to clean energy to natural foods. And education is one of our very first companies, School Runner, which we invested in 2015. And since then, we've invested in 2 additional education companies, more so in the adult education, enterprise learning space, Galvanize, and then Secure Set. We typically write anywhere from $1 million to $5 million checks, and we have 8 investments to date. And my background is somewhat bizarre as well. I've worked on Wall Street in investment banking, and then also worked 10 miles down the road at an all-boys public charter school in Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, managing their operations and finances.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me without the microphone? Oh, yeah. The live stream can't, so I do need the microphone. Mind, I'll take one of those things. I think it's turned off. Okay, I think we're back. Very good. So I've got some questions for this power-packed panel here. I'd like to take a look back at the last few years, kind of where we've come in terms of EdTech. So just a little bit of data for you. We've seen, I think it's a 5 or 6x increase in the amount of capital invested in education technology over the last 5 or 6 years. 2016, we had a bit of a bump, but the first half of 2017 is looking very, very strong. And I guess the question is, why is that? Why is EdTech investing? I mean, this isn't the first time people have thought of technology and education. Why is that?
I'll start. I think technology has played a huge role in expanding personalization, accessibility, and lowering costs across schools in the US and also internationally. I think you can see some of these trends with accessibility and personalization with companies in the MOOC space, massive online open courses, companies like Era and Udacity. And in the cost space, there are international for-profit schools like Bridge International Academies that started a decade ago, but already has 100,000 students whose families pay typically $1 a month. But those students have outcomes that dramatically outperform the regular traditional public schools managed by the government. And so I think these 3 trends in particular, personalization, accessibility, and cost, have created a new era for EdTech.
I think also there's a really significant change going on in students in education, particularly higher education, where they're driving a lot of the trends around global, anytime learning. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Better. And again, so the student is driving these trends, and now we have more flexible technology that can move with that. Students demand more from their education, so the average student age right now is between 24 and 31 years old in the United States. That's a significant shift from 10 years ago. So institutions are trying very hard to appeal to those students. There's competition in the marketplace in higher education like there's never been before, because nationally enrollments are flat, and so they're competing for students. So they have to change. They have to embrace new technologies in order to keep those students.
One of the things that I think the $1 trillion in debt has also kind of been a trend that investors have been kind of wondering, and students have been wondering, what are the other possibilities out there? We do a lot of studies with data. We have our own research lab internally at the organization, and one of the other things that had emerged in some of the analysis that we have done is the most successful students, non-related to the background that they're coming from, are those that the solutions that are surrounding them are not only in schools. So data has become very important in the way that governments are kind of using the data from different sources and really understanding what's the success that it's really moving that either low-income kid or high-income kid to a successful outcome. The one thing that I would say is that in the last 3 years, we have only seen 3.6% of all the investments going to the early childhood space. And I'll talk a little bit more about that.
I would say in K-12, a couple of things. I mean, one, you've seen cuts upon cuts upon cuts, especially since Great Recession, that haven't been, made up for as the economy's gotten better. So necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, I think you look at places like, in California, where their school funding is even worse than ours is here, you've seen some really innovative players like Rocket Ship use technology to have higher, larger class sizes, but use technology to still get better outcomes for cheaper. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is you've got a new crop of teachers coming into the profession. You talk about students demanding more, but especially in K-12, I think teachers are demanding more, where they walk into their jobs and they're being expected to go find the tools to do their jobs. I mean, I hire engineers and I don't say, go figure out, what development environment you want to use. And no, I say, this is how we do things. Here's the tools you need to do your job. Now go, write code. So the idea that for teachers, we're saying, go online and cobble together some free stuff you can find and maybe pay for some stuff and build your own curriculum and set of tools. I mean, that's crazy. And so I think teachers are driving some of this trend in K-12 too.
And I would add too, in K-12, just a couple of basic things that I think many of us may have taken for granted in our own homes for many years, but are relatively new developments in K-12. 95% of schools now have broadband access. You go back 10 years ago, that was in the teens. By next year, it should be 99% of schools with broadband. The other one is just the proliferation of cheap devices as well. So it's only in recent years that you've been able to get a $200 or less Chromebook. You see more and more classrooms going with one-to-one devices. I think that's a trend that will continue. And that just makes access to technology in school possible for those that don't have access at home, don't have wireless at home. So great background. I guess thinking about the present time, there are a number of things in education technology that are hyped. There are also other things that may be a little bit overhyped. Would love to get your take on maybe some things that you're excited about and why, and then if you want, something that you think might be a little bit overhyped as well. Maybe we can start with Charlie if you want, and
sure.
Go the other way.
I'm super excited about virtual reality in K-12. I know that some people will probably say that's overhyped, but I actually think it's super interesting. It's super exciting. Again, especially with cheap devices, right? The fact that with a Google Cardboard and an Android phone, reasonable experience. I think that engaging students is always a big challenge, and saying, we're going to put stuff online and it's going to be interactive. Well, I just think there's a lot of room to do even more than that with some VR technology. One thing I think is underhyped, if I can answer that question that you didn't ask, I think there's so much thought when you think about EdTech and you say, okay, what does that mean? Well, it means technology that is going to sit on a screen and a student is going to use that. Everybody take a step back for a second and ask yourself, I have a 10-year-old kid, how many hours a day do I want them sitting in front of a screen, right? I guarantee you that answer is not 10 hours a day, right? So what is our optimal balance of technology for student use, especially at younger ages? Maybe that's different in higher ed, but especially with the younger ages. How much do we actually want kids sitting in front of a screen? Okay, now back out from that. Where are all the other places that technology can play a part that don't involve a kid sitting in front of a screen, right? And so for us, we think about like, well, how can I empower a teacher with data to make better decisions? That's a piece of technology in education, but it's not kids sitting in front of iPad learning how to do math better.
I'll add to that. Is this okay or okay? Thank you. Okay. Just saw the audience reacting every time I spoke. Hope it's not my accent. I think to your point, Charlie, we know that the brain development of a young kid goes up to 80% in their first 3 years of life. And if we are not careful in terms of that technology, then there's a couple of things that we will be messing up, right? So I think the interactive play and using technology in a way that it's in, but more technology out, and how are we thinking about using technology and data to really provide a voice for 0 to 5-year-olds in with the wearables and the biometric and just bioscience, and how do we think about those pieces in terms of commercializing the research that the early childhood space have done for a long, long time, but they have been never able to really commercialize that. So that's one area that I'm very excited about. Just how do you break the silos between research, academics, and then entrepreneurs and investors coming together? When we first invested in our first for-profit deal, we looked at the App Store and Google Drive and Google Play and all those things. There were a ton of apps, like just incredible number of apps for parenting advice, for all these things. Very few of them had a research-based component. And I think that's one also area that it's kind of overhyped because everybody's just creating apps and apps and apps. I think the ones that we need to put attention on are the ones really connecting the research base behind them.
I think the thing that excites me most is the use of data in higher education. And again, we've always had a lot of data, but we've not been able to extract it and put it into a form that can be consumed and acted on. That's really exciting. It's a significant trend for us in higher education. As institutions are trying to compete with each other, they're also trying to gain greater insight into learning and keep institutions. We have a big problem with national dropout rates. We have over 31 dropouts, people who start and don't complete. And that's why programs like the CSU Global MBA is important, because people are going to school, they have significant event, and data into complete. And so it also helps in cutting down costs and efficiencies of the institution. So they can scale, they can offer more, and they can, again, create a much more transparent process for the student as they go through their education.
For me, I would say the investment theme that I'm personally most bullish on is anything related to adult learning or corporate learning. And when I was on a diligence call a year ago or so with a director of HR of a tech company who was telling us that the half-life of technical content knowledge is 2 to 3 years, meaning half of the technical content that you learn is going to be completely irrelevant in 2 to 3 years. And Charlie can corroborate that or not. But regardless, even if it's a tenth of that, there's just a lot of ongoing professional development and upskilling that's required even for the workforce that's already in a job. And I think that extends also to adults who are looking for a job. And so 2 of our portfolio companies, Galvanize and SecureSet, you see kids enrolling in their programs who but are struggling to find quality jobs. And after a 6-month boot camp at SecureSet, where they are getting an education in cybersecurity, they're able to get an entry-level job that pays $85,000 a year. So I think companies in that space, I'm particularly bullish on.
I'm going to ask a follow-up, actually. One thing I didn't hear, but that technology is taken off, I'd say just in the last 12 to 18 months, is artificial intelligence, machine learning. I don't know how many conversations I've had with entrepreneurs who've built chatbots just in the last 4 to 6 months. I think there might be a bit of a chatbot bubble at this point. But I'd love a take. Anybody has any take on artificial intelligence, machine learning? There are conversations going on about how that fits in with the role of the teacher, the educator. Does it replace the teacher, the educator? Does it enhance? Any thoughts on that folks have?
I can start with that, Graham. So we had conversation with IBM Watson and the partnership that they're building together with Sesame Street. It was an incredibly exciting conversation because they know the research, they know all that it takes, and it's really about how can this technology empower what's happening already in the classroom. So they had They had connected all these sensors in kind of a Montessori type classroom, and then they have all the data tracking how the kids are really using it, and then teachers can actually react to say, this kid needs to spend more time with this toy, or look, we have never thought about how the brain of the child is developing with this particular toy, because that's not the purpose of the toy. So it's just very interesting. On the other hand, we were at a conference with the National Head Start Association. So we had 300 practitioners and administrators of Head Start, and all of them said, we will never go there, like with artificial intelligence, like machine learning, never. But there were a few that were incredibly interested, and they actually came over to us and said, if you ever are trying to invest in a technology like that, use us as a business case. So there's now a little bit of openness in some pockets for not only government-funded schools, but also like Wildflower, which is a school in the East Coast, that it's really kind of moving in this direction of how do you insert machine learning into their environment.
I think an interesting statistic that I saw recently, PwC released a study that suggested that 38% of employees today will be in jobs that will be automated through AI or robots in 15 years. Charlie might say that that's a bubble. But regardless, there's going to be a lot of jobs in 15 years, maybe not a year from now, but 15 years from now that, or there's going to be the absence of a lot of jobs that today are not existing 15 years from now. And I think AI in the near term with chatbots, if that's the extent of them, I don't think they're going to transform outcomes significantly, but 15 years from now, I would imagine that they would.
And we can see some signs of that in driving, personal assistance, help desk, those types of things. We're starting to see some changes there. So I was thinking about this before our conversation, but the internet has fundamentally changed a number of sectors. You think about the travel industry, you think about finance, retail, even transportation now, we're seeing major changes. My sense is we haven't quite seen that transformation yet in education. Why do you think that is? And do you think things are going to change in the future? Or do you think we're going to continue to lag other industries in terms of transformation with the internet?
Well, I would just say there are structural challenges. That's my nice way of saying that selling into K-12 sucks. But honestly, I mean, you have a lot of sort of built-in structural challenges to overhauling that industry compared to travel agents, right? It's very difficult. Again, going back to, especially I think about the world from a K-12 lens, you think about younger kids, the idea of saying that technology is going to somehow step in and play the role of a human that is motivating you to care about doing any of this, right? You might have the AI that says you should play with that toy, but how is that actually happening? There's a human that's going, hey, why don't you try this one, right? And so I think it does change the role of the teacher, but it's not so fundamental. I think, even going back to your previous question about machine learning, I mean, these are tools, right? I mean, we lost lots of jobs in agriculture to mechanization, right? To machines, right? So now we're saying, oh, the computer going to learn and they're going to, jobs. Yeah, that's true, but that's a continuation of a trend. It's not a brand new thing that we've never seen before. But yeah, I just think in K-12, those structural challenges of especially without sort of necessarily the incentives to innovate necessarily. There's there are plenty of people out there who are very happy with the status quo of what goes on in K-12. And so those are all big challenges.
I'd actually disagree with you, and I'd say that it has fundamentally transformed higher education on a global scale. And I'm talking through the lens of access. So it's allowed underserved communities all over the world to access, phenomenal educational resources and succeed and be successful. It's also helped to scale, so we can meet many more learners. It's brought down the cost of education in many countries. So I'm thinking outside of the United States, really. But within the United States, I think in the higher education structure, it is starting to break down the walls of the legacy of teaching and this whole tenure idea at institutions where those are the major barriers. I think now institutions are making some really bold moves, and they're going outside of that traditional governance model, creating separate entities like the Purdue-Kaplan, the recent merger. ASU has created their own separate 501c, which is a for-profit institution where they can do whatever they want. They don't have to abide by the rules of the larger institution, and so they can adopt a lot of these new technologies and models, and that's exactly what they're doing.
It was a $1 acquisition too, wasn't it? Maybe you can explain to me later exactly why it was $1. Good. Did you have something too, Kyle, you wanted to add?
I was just going to talk about K-12 very briefly. So I think selling into K-12 sucks. But I think there are people who say that school districts are bad customers. And I think the distinction is that school districts are bad prospects. And in fact, like once you land a contract with them, they can be great customers just because they're unlikely to ever leave you. Your product or service will become really sticky. So I think it's similar to any organization that sells into an industry with big RFP processes with a lot of headaches. But once you're into a utility or a governmental institution or a school district, it's hard to rip you out.
But I will say one thing about the internet, and we talked about how much selling in K-12. I won't say it sucks, but I'll say it's hard. And if it was easy, everybody would be doing it well. But it is very hard to do well. The internet, I think, is changing business models. When we look at now, this isn't necessarily translating into revenue yet, but when we think about 10 years ago, the ability to launch an application like Remind or Class Dojo, these are a couple of K-12 tools that are now in use in 30, 40, 50% of the schools in America, and they were just launched 24, 36 months ago. We really didn't see that type of rapid adoption, even 5, 7, 10 years ago. So I think the internet, cheap devices, access to the internet universally across schools, that is changing that. Now, hopefully what we see, and kind of segueing into the next topic, maybe one of the things that we'll see in the future is we'll actually see more entrepreneurs who've figured out better hacks for selling into education, led by a model like the freemium model, for example. I think it's coming. I don't know who's going to do it, but I think, or selling efficiently to teachers is another example, as opposed to selling at the university, teachers and professors, as opposed to the university or the school level. So talk about, Charlie helped me frame this one up. We usually talk about what is going to happen in 5 to 10 years, what's likely to change. Let's start with what's not going to change as we look ahead in the next 5 to 10 years. And then if you want to add your forecast or your prediction, would love to hear that as well.
I think one thing that's not going to change is local control in school districts. So there are 15,000 school districts in this country, mid-air, and I think with the current administration, there's an even increased emphasis on local control. And so I think in the countries where you see the most innovation, it can be led from the top. Enablement of technology can be encouraged from the top, and I think it's going to be really hard to do that in traditional schools. Really hard to change.
I think that's actually a hard question at the higher ed level, because so much is going to change and is changing as started, as I just said. I think the one thing that's not going to change is the need for a third party to come in and help an institution through their transformation. And that's through technologies, through services, particularly. They need those bespoke services. They don't have that knowledge or understanding on how to create and transform like a business. And a lot of institutions are now having to think like that. So that's going to be a constant, I think, for the next 5 to 10 years.
One of the things that I will say that will not change is the number of dual income earners in a family. I think it's been very interesting for us to watch just how much stress and how much work time a family needs to devote. And then I think the average kind of time that a family spends to together with their kids. Right now it's at 30 minutes. And I think that's getting kind of more kind of smaller and smaller, that window. So that I think it won't change. So then the ability for entrepreneurs to look at opportunities of how do you really increase education and the quality of that interaction will become very interesting. The other thing that I think is changing is the average time for a first-time mom. It came from 2000, I think it was 20 years old. Now it's 27 years old. So it also changed a little bit of how we think about early childhood and just kind of the different education components moving up.
So I'll argue with myself, which is I'm really curious to see how this notion of, you talked about really early childhood screen time, and that is currently viewed as like a really damaging, deadly thing. It's a great article a long time ago, several years ago in the Atlantic, about showing kids Sesame Street, and they record the brain developments, you know what I'm talking about? And then they like chop it up and show it in the wrong order, and the brain energy, whatever they're measuring, goes way down. Not my specialty. But the point being that actually there's a lot. We think of, you know, the boob tube as being, you know, you sit in front of the TV, you're not engaged, you're just spacing out. Actually, there's a lot more going on there. So I'm actually really curious to see where things go, especially in kind of the very, very early childhood, around use of screens, and do we decide actually, you know, this is great, and that iPad app where you hit the cow and make it moo is just as good as the Fisher-Price thing that you hit and make it moo. So that's one thing on that end I'm excited about, and then, or interested about. And then I would say on the other end, the Galvanizes of the world, the G schools, you know, I think they started out from this massive market. If you go to code.org, you can find all the stats on the gap between the number of CS graduates we have and the number of programming jobs we have, and it's you know, off by millions. So I think they started off with this giant, juicy, low-hanging fruit of let's just create web developers out of baristas, 2 of which I've hired. But then you see them start moving sideways into adjacent areas. Oh, let's teach people how to be user experience designers. Let's teach them how to be do all these other things. And so I think as we figure out what are the, you know, I just saw someone posting today asking, where can you send someone to go learn how to be a product manager, right? And no one was saying like, are there good 4-year programs where you graduate with a degree in product? No, it was like, I have a person, I want to have them come back a product manager, right? So I think those really targeted may or may not be online. You look at the G schools of the world, that stuff is in person, but at least partially. And I think as we figure out what are more and more of those jobs, what are more of those things that we need in this new economy that we don't have people you know, in abundance, there's going to be more and more of these training programs to fill that gap.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of cliche that we hear the world is changing faster than it ever has. I don't think is any different, and traditional universities struggle to keep pace with some of these emerging areas, these emerging niches that need to be met. So we see a lot of those boot camps and just the specialty programs that are popping up to be able to fill that need. Anybody want to make a bold prediction, a bold forecast for the next 5 or 10 years? Anything controversial or otherwise?
I think I'll go with your kind of comment before. I think the amount of capital that will flow into the early childhood space will change drastically in the next 10 years. The reason I say that is because of what you're saying, Charlie. I think science and research have come to a place where return on investment is there, where there's so many now peripheral technologies that could really understand what data is effective and what's not. And then we have been talking to a lot of fund managers internationally and nationally, and they're very interested in seeing kind of the same momentum that they saw in EdTech and applying those tools earlier. So there's all this momentum of entrepreneurs and scientists and researchers coming together for the first time. So I guess in the next 10 years, we'll see a lot of just companies popping up in that space and a lot of capital too.
This is something that I'm not highly confident will occur in the future, but I'm hopeful will. I'm very hopeful that in the future, our pre-K, K-12, and higher ed educators will be compensated in a way that consistently attracts the best and the brightest and enables them to stay in the classrooms. Like Luis spoke to, just the huge advantages from high quality instruction at early ages, and you see that in classrooms throughout K-12 and higher ed. And so I just hope as a society we figure out a way that is able to enable us to retain our best and the brightest.
I think that, again, this is happening now, but it'll continue to happen, and that is the large 4-year institution in higher ed will become much more focused on competencies rather than a transcript at the end of a 4-year degree. They're already changing their models, just as we talked about. They're offering those nano credentials and shorter credentials that take 4, 6, 8 weeks for someone to complete, to upskill. So they'll be evaluating you on what you know rather than what they think your grade translates to. So it'll be much more specific to evidence of learning. You'll be able to know what someone knows, and there'll be a much better marriage between your education and where you're going to work.
So we've got some bold predictions and some hopes. I'm with you, Kyle. I'm not. I wouldn't predict that, but I'm hopeful. So with that, there's lots more we can talk about. Let me stop just for a moment and see if anybody has questions that they'd like for the panel. Did we scare you all out of questions? Scott.
So it's interesting that Graham's first question was about this growth investment. Not a single one of you answered the question. You all answered it sort of hopeful that we're going to change the world, so there's new opportunities, there's new technology. Do you think that that's really what's driving it? Is that, 6 years ago, as an EdTech investor, you just couldn't find something you wanted to invest in? Or do you think that there's just more interest from investors?
I think part of it stems from some of the things that we talked about, namely many other sectors of the economy have been transformed significantly, and education to me tends to get there, but it's often 5 to 10 years lagging innovations in other sectors. So 5 to 10 years later feels about right, which is sort of where we are. That coupled with the fact that we've got the digital tracks have been laid. You've got, at least in K-12, you've got 95% of schools on broadband. You've got cheap devices proliferating. If you think about that, and the fact that it's easier now than ever to spin up a startup, you don't have to raise $5 million now to get going and operating a business. All the other things outside of education enable that. How much do we invest in education in this country? It's 9% of our economy. Yet if you look at the listed, it's less than 1% of the market cap. So there's an opportunity there when you've got 9% of the GDP and less than 1% of the broadest index, right? Whatever the 5,000 is. So I think the time has come, and I think we're still figuring out. So some of the points earlier about, it's hard to sell into education. Some of these innovations around business models are early, but that would be a bold prediction that I would make, is in the next 5 years, somebody's going to figure out how to sell rapidly into schools beyond the freemium to actually convert them to paying customers very, very quickly. That'd be my prediction for the next 5 years.
The one thing that I would add is that we did a sort of a capital scan from startup, seed, all the way to private equity. And we noticed one thing: there's a white space in the seed capital, Series A capital, especially for the early childhood kind of development side. There's a ton of money on the private equity side. And this is companies that have bought curriculum companies, classrooms, like providers. So the infrastructure is there and the exit is ready to go. So funds, I think, have been understanding that once they see entrepreneurial activity and interest, they will put capital to kind of just fill the gap and then that connection will happen. So I think that's one of the things that we're also seeing right now. There's a lot of interest from investors and from philanthropy that have been there kind of really supporting the nonprofit side and understanding that the solutions might not be scalable, might not be kind of the real things that we need to see. And they're saying, well, we have poured billions of dollars into the early childhood space on the nonprofit side. How do we then complement that with a for-profit angle? So there's now a ton of investment coming from the same folks that know the space, ready to go with the for-profit side.
Maybe one more.
Back left.
No, right back there.
Yeah, so the question is expanding on the model that goes alongside the research side. One of the things that I would recommend to any entrepreneur that is coming into the early childhood space is they really need to co-develop the solution or the product with an early care provider or an institution. Otherwise, it's so hard to break into the system, and especially the early childhood side, which is so fragmented, right? So that's one of the things that I would just highlight, I think, and suggest.
Great point. We've got time for one more. Anybody else has a question? John, I saw yours first.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the push and the pull of education. In my life, I saw most information systems kind of go from broadcast to interactive to a point where we as individuals create most of the content today. In education, what's the shift between curriculum-driven versus self-directed education?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess personally, I'm very bullish on the self-directed approach. I mean, as an entrepreneur, that's how we were trained sitting up here. And I think we talk about this current generation and having 16 jobs on average is what the forecasts are. You need to learn for life. You need to develop the skills to be able to learn throughout your life, because your job could be disintermediated by AI at some point in time. If Kyle's statistics are right, you've got a 38% chance. So you have to. So if there's one skill that's critical, it's how do you learn how to learn. So I look at the self-directed, project-based, problem-based, experiential learning in schools. That's something that I'm hopeful we'll see a lot more of from early childhood all the way up to higher education.
I would just say there's a lot of push in terms of the trends around self-directed. Competency-based is a term you hear a lot. I went to a super hippie, they called it a Dewey school, very Montessori, experiential. And I think the big issue was, for me, it was fantastic. It was great. I got to go as fast as I wanted. There were other kids who sat in the corner and played with blocks in the 5th grade, right? So how do we, from the perspective of the overall public school system, how do we make sure that we are actually advancing kids along and that we don't have figured out yet? How do those things fit together?
I would say, though, you were talking about competency-based, and that is a significant trend for us in higher education. So it is that self-directed. There's a real desire for that in the marketplace. I think it's a bit scary to those tried and true brick and mortar institutions. They're not ready to let go of that yet. They're experimenting with those models. They're experimenting with companies like mine. We're developing a lot of those self-directed models for them or with them in partnership. And they can take on any kind of form. But Western Governors University is an excellent example of a competency-based university, really properly training students in how to think, problem solve, and they're very successful in the completion rates. So it's a model that works, but it scares the living daylights out of a lot of the larger four-year institutions at this point.
So I want to thank the panelists, and again, thank Rockies Venture Club for allowing us this chance.